They called it a celebration, but everything about it felt slightly off, like a suit tailored for the wrong person. The banners listed quarterly wins without names. The slideshow looped achievements with no faces attached. Even the applause arrived too early, like people were nervous about clapping late. Calvin Stroud stood near the center of it all, glass already half empty, scanning the room the way executives scan balance sheets, 18 months since his arrival. And already he had perfected the posture of ownership. When he reached for the microphone, he didn't look at the crowd, he looked straight at me. "Let's be honest," Calvin said, smiling thinly. "Tonight isn't about titles, it's about alignment." A few people laughed. I didn't. Then he paused, long enough to make the silence uncomfortable. "After careful consideration," he said, eyes still fixed on me, "Daisy's role will be restructured." The word landed with intent. Not fired, not promoted, restructured. Safe enough for HR, sharp enough for the room. That feeling is unpleasant. Just like the cold weather. It's really cold where I am right now. How about where you're listening to this story? What's the temperature like right now? And if you're still here, please leave me your lucky number. I felt it immediately. 9 years of operational control evaporated into a footnote. No path forward, no explanation. Just removal, done publicly, cleanly. And with a smile, Calvin continued, praising adaptability, praising momentum, praising the person he was about to elevate. Someone who had never carried the weight I had. Applause followed. Not enthusiastic. Obligatory. I had kept this company running through failures no one ever saw. I knew which systems moved hundreds of millions and which ones would collapse without warning. Calvin knew how to rename my work and sell it upward. He called that vision. I called it survival by omission. When the applause faded, I raised my glass. "Congratulations," I said evenly. "You've earned it." Calvin nodded, pleased, already turning away. As conversation resumed, my hand slipped into my jacket pocket. The phone was warm. I didn't check the screen. I didn't need to. The recording was still running. Before we go any further, I want to clarify one thing. Some characters, events, and timelines in this story have been fictionalized, with the support of AI-assisted storytelling, to better highlight the emotional and ethical lessons behind it. I hope you'll stay with me and find something meaningful in this story. But if today isn't the right time, that's completely okay too. Please get some rest and take good care of yourself. I didn't sleep after the party, not because of shock, but because patterns I had ignored finally lined up. Every major win Calvin bragged about had passed through my hands first, when a vendor failure threatened to shut down distribution. I rebuilt the workflow overnight and stopped a $42 million operational loss before finance even noticed. When 3 strategic clients signaled they were ready to walk, I stepped in, renegotiated terms, and stabilized accounts that represented 31% of our total revenue. Those moments never made it into Calvin's speeches. He preferred abstractions, vision, scale, momentum, once. Behind a closed door, he said it plainly, "You're too operational. Leadership needs vision." He said it like a diagnosis, as if understanding how the company actually functioned was a flaw. I nodded then. The way you do when you realize the conversation isn't about truth. What Calvin called vision was built on dashboards I designed, risk models I maintained, and data pipelines I protected from interference. He presented conclusions without understanding the machinery underneath them. I started to see it clearly. As long as I was visible, his authority was fragile. As long as I stayed, someone could trace the work back to its source. The final confirmation came during a closed meeting I wasn't supposed to hear about. My name surfaced. Calvin didn't lower his voice. He didn't need to. "She knows too much," he said. There was no anger in it, in that moment. The bitterness settled. I waited a full day before opening the folder. Not out of fear, but discipline. Emotional reactions leave fingerprints, and I needed clean hands. When I finally sat down, I listened from the beginning. Months of recorded meetings, calls, and hallway conversations Calvin assumed were temporary. His voice was consistent, calm, certain. "We don't need to slow this down with another risk review," he said during one operations call. "Just move it forward." In another recording, he pushed a director to sign off on a decision that clearly exceeded her authority. "It's fine," Calvan told her. "I'll take responsibility." She hesitated. The silence stretched. Then the sound of a pen. I listened without reacting. No anger, no shock, just confirmation. These weren't mistakes, they were habits. Patterns repeated when no one was supposed to be listening. Each file filled another gap in the story he had been rewriting in public. I didn't send anything. I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I copied every file, created secure backups, and labeled them by date, topic, and risk category. Process before emotion. That had always been my rule. Encryption followed, then redundancy. Calvin believed power lived in titles. I knew it lived in documentation. As I worked, I remembered how often he dismissed my cautions as operational noise. Now that noise had a voice, his voice, clear enough to stand on its own. The last file stopped me. Different tone, different room, a legal briefing. Calvin again, confident as ever. Then another voice joined in. Familiar and careful. "Our internal counsel, if anyone asks," the lawyer said. "We'll deal with it later, right now. It's better not to create a paper trail." I paused the recording and sat back. That sentence changed everything. Until then, this had been about misconduct. Now it was about intent. I closed the folder gently, my pulse steady. Calvin thought he had erased me. What he'd really done was leave a record. I understood then that silence wasn't weakness, it was leverage, and I finally knew when, and how, to use it without apology or hesitation from that moment. I submitted my resignation the way I handled everything else quietly, correctly, and without emotion, no accusations, no speeches, just a formal notice delivered through the proper channel. Time-stamped, compliant, impossible to challenge. When Calvin read it, he didn't look surprised. He looked relieved. He called me into his office that afternoon, wearing the small smile he reserved for moments he thought he'd won. "So this is it?" he asked. "I didn't expect you to make it so easy." I nodded. "I'm following policy," I said. That answer seemed to please him more than any argument ever had. What Calvin didn't hear past his own confidence was the clause attached to my departure. 30 days of structured system transition, full documentation handover, continued monitoring access to ensure operational continuity. It was language I had written years earlier, buried deep in governance updates no one else bothered to read. He signed without hesitation for the next weeks. I worked methodically. I walked teams through workflows they had never fully understood. I labeled dependencies, mapped exceptions, and documented risk paths that had lived only in my head. Calvan passed my desk occasionally, nodding with satisfaction, already planning announcements about streamlined leadership. "You'll be surprised how replaceable people are," he told me once, almost kindly. I smiled and kept typing. What he never asked was how the systems actually thought. He knew the dashboards. I knew the logic underneath them, the shortcuts, the assumptions, the fragile points that only held because I watched them daily. Transition documents can explain structure. They can't transfer instinct. On my final day, Calvin shook my hand. "Clean exit," he said. "No drama." He believed control meant signatures and authority. I believed it meant understanding consequences before they appeared. As I logged out for the last time, alerts continued flowing to my monitoring access, exactly as the contract allowed. The company still ran smoothly. For now, Calvin stood confident at the center of it, unaware that the system obeyed rules he didn't understand. And that made all the difference. Soon, the illusion would fracture under its own weight. If you agree with the way I chose to leave quietly, follow the rules, and secure control through proper process instead of confrontation, press number 1 in the comments. The first alerts appeared quietly, the way serious problems always do. A red indicator on a revenue dashboard, a delayed approval notice that shouldn't have stalled. Nothing dramatic enough to panic over, which is exactly why no one noticed at first. I noticed. Of course. My monitoring access was still active, exactly as the transition clause allowed. By the second week, the warnings multiplied. Systems began flagging exceptions Calvin didn't recognize. Instead of asking questions, he accelerated. He signed off on expedited decisions, bypassed secondary reviews, and approved funding reallocations with a confidence that came from not understanding the consequences. In meetings, he called it momentum. "We don't need friction right now," he said. Speed wins. Speed did win, just not for him. One approval triggered another, each one stacking against compliance thresholds I had built deliberately. When a transaction crossed a regulatory boundary without proper authorization, the response was automatic. Funds froze mid-transfer, $11.6 million locked in place. Inaccessible, untouchable, perfectly still. Calvin demanded answers. Finance blamed operations. Operations blamed compliance. Compliance pulled documentation. That's when the email surfaced. It was an automated alert, sent exactly as designed. Clear subject line, neutral language, no accusation, just process. The signature at the bottom stopped the room cold. My name, not because I sent it, but because I had authored the framework years earlier. The warning followed the protocol I'd insisted on implementing after an audit everyone else wanted to forget. Calvin stared at the screen like it had personally betrayed him. "I don't understand," he said. "Why would this trigger now?" No one answered. The system had answered already. From my desk at home, I watched the scramble unfold with a calm I hadn't expected. There was no satisfaction in it, just confirmation. Calvin believed authority overrode structure. He believed signatures created reality. What he never learned was that systems don't respond to confidence. They respond to rules. By the end of the day, the freeze was still in place. Lawyers were involved, meetings were scheduled, and the company was discovering something I had known for years. The system wasn't broken, it was obedient. Just not to him. I thought the freeze would buy Calvin time. Instead, it exposed something he couldn't control: memory. Clients remember who keeps their businesses alive. The first request came through compliance. Flagged urgent. A major logistics partner wanted a direct call with me. Not my replacement, not Calvin. An hour later, a second message arrived from a financial services client whose contracts alone justified Calvin's confidence. Both used the same phrase. "We need to speak with Daisy." Calvin tried to intercept. He scheduled update calls, sent reassurances, promised resolutions. I heard his voice on one forwarded voicemail, tight and forced. "There's no need to involve former staff," he said. "We have leadership coverage." The clients declined politely. Coverage wasn't what they were asking for. I joined the first call from my home office. Calm, professional, unbranded, no titles, no authority claimed. Just familiarity. We reviewed impacts, timelines, and controls. When I finished, there was a pause on the line. "This feels different," one executive said. "You actually understand the exposure." On the second call, the tone shifted. Less patience, more concern. Then the question came, direct and precise. "Can we hear the risk discussion from last quarter?" Not a demand, a test. Calvin hadn't known that meeting existed. He'd delegated it, dismissed it, forgotten it. I remembered everything. "Yes," I said evenly. "I can provide that. I didn't play it, not yet. I simply acknowledged its existence." Silence followed, heavier than any accusation. One client thanked me, another said they'd be in touch after the calls ended. I sat still for a moment. There was satisfaction there, but I kept it contained. This wasn't about winning clients. It was about confirmation. Titles don't earn trust. Consistency does. Somewhere in the building, Calvin was realizing that influence doesn't follow hierarchy. It follows reliability, and reliability leaves a record. He ignored that lesson completely. I expected the calls before the email. Threats usually arrive dressed as professionalism. Calvin asked for a private meeting. citing confidentiality concerns and legal exposure. I agreed, because refusal would have looked like guilt, and guilt was the only thing he needed me to show. He didn't waste time. He slid a document across the table. Already signed on his end. You're bound by your NDA, he said. Any further involvement with clients creates liability. We can make this easy, or we can make it expensive. His voice tightened on the last word. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I placed my phone on the table, screen down, exactly between us. That unsettled him more than any response could have. You think this is a game, he snapped. I built this leadership structure. I decide who speaks for the company. His sentences began to overlap. Urgency replacing control. He reminded me of severance clauses, non-disparagement language, future employability. People who don't cooperate, he said, tend to disappear quietly. I watched him unravel without interrupting. Silence creates space, and Calvin filled it recklessly. He leaned forward. Those recordings you're hinting at, he said, lowering his voice. They don't mean what you think they mean. Everyone cuts corners. That's how companies grow. He laughed once, sharp and hollow. Legal cleans it up later. That sentence lingered. He stood abruptly. Pacing. If this turns into an issue, I'll say you misinterpreted instructions. I'll say you acted independently. No one will back you. He stopped and looked at me, searching for fear. I picked up my phone and stood. We're done, I said calmly. He froze. What Calvin never realized was that pressure doesn't silence preparation. As I left the room, the recording ended automatically. Time stamped and clear. He had wanted my silence. Instead, he gave me something better. Control was slipping from his hands, and he didn't even notice the moment it crossed into permanent, documented consequence without any chance left. The invitation arrived without explanation, just a calendar block marked urgent and mandatory. By the time I entered the boardroom, everyone was already seated, eyes fixed forward, tension hanging low and electric. Calvin stood near the screen, arms crossed, confident enough to look bored. No one asked why I was there. They didn't need to. The chair nodded for me to speak. I didn't sit. I didn't open a deck. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I simply said, I brought documentation. Then I placed my phone on the table and pressed play. Calvin's voice filled the room first, relaxed and unmistakable. We don't need another risk review, he said. Move it forward. A shuffle of papers followed. Then a quieter exchange about approvals, about signatures that could be handled later. No commentary from me, no framing, just sound. A second recording followed. Calvin again, sharper this time. If compliance asks questions, we'll clean it up after. Then the voice of internal counsel, cautious but clear. We'll deal with it later. Don't create a paper trail. I watched faces change as recognition replaced disbelief. No one interrupted. No one cleared their throat. The air felt heavier with every second that passed. Calvin didn't move. He stared at the table as if distance might erase what everyone had just heard. When the recording stopped, I didn't fill the silence. I didn't need to. Documentation doesn't argue. It waits. The chair finally spoke, voice controlled, deliberate. Is this complete? I nodded. There's more, I said. But this is sufficient. Calvin opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since I'd known him, there was nothing he could reframe, nothing he could spin. His authority had depended on confidence. Confidence collapses when evidence speaks for itself. The room stayed silent longer than was comfortable. It wasn't shock, it was processing. Consequences forming quietly in real time. I gathered my phone and stepped back. Pulse steady. The explosion wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It had already happened. Nothing else was required. Because the truth had finally taken control here. Suspension came quickly. Not with drama, but with procedure. Calvin was escorted out under the language of interim measures. Access revoked. Calendar wiped clean. No one cheered. The board announced an internal investigation paired with an independent audit, the kind designed to survive scrutiny. I watched from the side, detached, as processes I had built began working without my supervision. Days turned into interviews. Compliance asked precise questions. Auditors requested logs, approvals, and timelines. I answered calmly, referencing documents, never opinions. Evidence doesn't raise its voice, it stacks. Each request narrowed the corridor Calvin could stand in. Legal phrased everything carefully, and I appreciated that restraint. Justice moves best when it isn't rushed. Then came the call. A board member I trusted asked if we could speak privately. He didn't apologize. He acknowledged, "We underestimated your role." He said, "We want to correct that." The offer was deliberate return with expanded authority, triple the decision rights, direct reporting to the board, compensation adjusted accordingly, power formalized. I listened without reacting. The offer made sense on paper. It would stabilize operations and signal accountability. For a moment, silence did the thinking for me. I declined. Not because it wasn't enough, but because it was too late. The structure failed when it relied on one person. I said, "Putting me back won't fix that." He tried again, softer. I stayed steady. Control wasn't my goal. Consequence was afterward. The investigation continued. Findings were documented. Recommendations issued. Calvin's suspension became permanent separation pending outcomes. The company moved, slower and cleaner, under rules it had ignored before. I walked out of the building lighter than I'd arrived. Cold justice isn't loud. It doesn't celebrate. It simply restores balance and leaves no doubt about what mattered. I didn't need a title to feel whole. I needed the truth to stand. And it did. That choice ended the story on my terms, not theirs. Accountability held, systems learned, and I moved forward intact. Justice didn't reward me, it corrected the imbalance. That was enough, and it will always be for the long arc of work ahead. News travels differently when it's final. Calvin Stroud's termination arrived as a notice citing ethical violations. No commentary attached. I didn't reread it. I didn't need to. The outcome had been set long before the investigation finished. What followed felt lighter. I registered my own operations advisory firm. Small by design, precise by intent, just systems, governance, and accountability. Within weeks, familiar names reached out. Former clients whose revenue once depended on my work. Choosing clarity over titles. Each contract was clean, negotiated without urgency. They weren't chasing revenge. And neither was I. They wanted reliability. So did I, that evening. I raised a glass alone. Not to victory, but to alignment. I thought back to that night everyone called a celebration, and finally understood why I'd been able to smile. I smiled at my promotion party because I already knew it wasn't my ending. It was my opening. I didn't leave that story thinking I was brave. I left realizing how quiet courage usually is. It doesn't look like speeches or slammed doors. It looks like staying steady when something inside you wants to react. It looks like choosing to understand the system instead of burning it down. What this experience taught me, more than anything, is that value isn't proven in moments of praise. It's proven in moments of pressure, when no one is watching, when credit disappears, when the easy path would be to explode or walk away angry. That's where character shows up, not loudly, but clearly. There's a question I keep coming back to. And maybe it's one worth asking yourself too. If you were in that position knowing the truth, holding the leverage, would you use it to hurt? Or would you use it to restore balance? Would your decision still feel right if no one ever applauded it? As you're listening to this, I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? A kitchen table, a long drive, a quiet room at the end of a hard day. Wherever you are, you're part of this moment too. Stories like this don't matter because of the ending. They matter because someone out there is standing at a crossroads, unsure, unseen, and tired. If staying with this channel helps these stories reach that person, then your support matters more than you think. A simple subscription, a like, or a share can help someone pause, reflect, and choose a better path.